So it seems Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was a bit of a flop. At least that's an article I came across on inverse.com. Says that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's sales have been much slower than Remake, which is to be expected. One, because Remake came out during the beginning of the pandemic and nobody was working. I think that's when everything had just shut down, so everybody was like at home, so they, were buying games and playing all this stuff. So of course sales are going to be a bit inflated for Remake, I feel like. But let's take a look at this article. I want to go through it and kind of point out a few things here. Square Enix's Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is one of the biggest games of the year, with its divisive open world and puzzling final hour dominating questions for weeks. Coming on the heels of the hit Final Fantasy VII Remake, it's natural to assume that Rebirth would be an easy win for Square Enix. But according to one analyst, its sales may not have stacked up, and that has me both worried and hopeful about the publisher's recent shift and strategy. So again, like during the pandemic was when Remake dropped, and of course everybody was at home, couldn't go out and do anything. So a lot of people were, I'm pretty sure if I remember correctly, the shutdown in the US anyway just happened like the week of Remake's launch. So it was because I was like really bummed out that I couldn't go pick it up physically and I had to buy it digitally. But everybody's home, so of course everybody's going to like play games and stuff, right? So I feel like these numbers are a bit like fudged or smudged or whatever. But let's see what the analyst has to say about the performance and stuff. Rebirth sold only around half of what Remake did shortly after its release, according to Daniel Ahmad, Director of Research and Insights at Nico Partners. It's selling about half of what Remake sold in the same time frame and looks like it'll have a weaker tail prior to any PS Plus title like release. It's selling half of what Remake did. Data from Ampere Analyst shows that Rebirth peaked at 2.2 million daily active users between its launch and April 10th. While that data doesn't represent every sale, it does suggest that the game's sales were behind 3.5 million copies that Square Enix reported FF7 Remake just sold in 3 days. It's always safe to assume Rebirth would sell fewer copies than Remake, it's because it's a sequel, and most part 2s or sequels of games, they kind of start dwindling down because it's a big investment and stuff. So that's to be expected. But if its sales are actually only half of Remake, that could spell trouble for its publisher. Earlier this year, Square Enix confirmed a shift in its strategy that could result in publishing fewer games throughout the year. We want to concentrate our development resources on carefully selected new titles that we will develop to a high level of quality, Square Enix president Kiryu said in a financial report. To achieve that, Square Enix could be moving away from mid-budget titles like Harvestella and Valkyrie Asylum, which were released in recent years to relatively little fanfare. The market is increasingly polarized between blockbuster and indie titles, but I feel like that we have developed many titles that fell somewhere in the middle, Kiryu said. I want to make clear distinctions going forward. That strategy makes sense if Square Enix can put out surefire blockbuster hits while launching successful, cheaper to make indie games. But unfortunately, there is no thing such as a surefire hit. If games as large and expensive as FF7 Rebirth fall behind Square Enix expectations, that could be dangerous for the publisher without mid-budget titles to fall back on. Kiryu specifically points out to Square's success with indie title Power Wash Simulator, but games of that size can't make up for the disappointing performance of tentpole games. We seem to be in this era of AAA or quadruple A games where people and developers and publishers are just putting like tons of money into one game, like millions of dollars into one game, and then they're unable to recoup that back or even break even because they're putting such crazy amounts of money into the game to make them. Personally, I don't think games need to have this giant budget and be this giant blockbuster Avengers or giant movie style production. Just games like Octopath Traveler, which I believe they mentioned in this article. Games like that are just fine. They do well. And of course, the big games like God of War or 7 Rebirth, they do sell, but they don't sell enough to make up for the cost it costs to make the games. And I don't think it's required to put that amount of money and effort into making those games, because it's not good for the companies, and they're going to end up burning themselves out or burning out of money pretty much, and then they're going to die. That's my take and my how I feel like it's going to go. Let's stick with the lower. We don't need to spend all this money on games. They don't need to have these giant long cutscenes. They don't need to be photorealistic graphics. To me, none of that stuff matters. Just make the gameplay fun. That's number one. As long as the gameplay is fun, you're great. Rebirth has an amazing gameplay system. I think the graphics look fine. I know people were complaining about the graphics and performance mode or graphics mode. I thought they were okay. It wasn't, you know, it looks better than it did back in 97. So I'm good. I'm good for that. You know, it is what it is. I would be okay if they even just upscaled and did or I would have been fine if they would have did an upscale of the OG game and made the complete OG game still voiced with the voice actors we have, and if they would have just added a few things but made the graphics like it is in Ever Crisis, the mobile game. Like, I don't think Remake Trilogy needed to be this giant big budget game for it to be as successful as it is or anything like that. They could have just upped the graphics a little bit, smoothed things out, and I feel like it would have been just fine. But lackluster Rebirth sales does not mean Square Enix is doomed though. Despite saying the publisher would focus on fewer releases, Kiryu also said that this year it's aiming for greater diversity in its games. That sounds somewhat contradictory, but he explains that Square Enix has been overly reliant on its biggest series, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. And we haven't had a new Dragon Quest in quite a few years. It's been a while, and I know we are due for what was it, Dragon Quest 13 or something? Dragon Quest, yeah, 13 I believe it is. But that was announced a couple years ago and we've not heard. It's been radio silent since then. While faltering sales for a tentpole title would hurt any publisher, disappointing performance for FF7 Rebirth could be proof that Square Enix needs to rely less on success of its biggest games. Even if Final Fantasy isn't a guaranteed success, it makes sense that the publisher would shift its attention to games as far from its famed RPG series as Power Wash Simulator. Square Enix has in fact been experimenting with titles outside of its established series for the past few years. Octopath Traveler is something of a revival of old school turn-based Final Fantasy, but without the recognizable name, with some fantastic twists on combat. Octopath Traveler is probably, in my opinion, one of the best things to come out of Square Enix in recent years. It was that I guess series at this point, because there's two, is such a good. Those two games are so good, and I hope that they make that a flagship series for them, but keep it that style of what is it, like a 2D, 3D, you know. That art style, that style of gameplay, just keep it that does well. It's great, it's fun. Titles like DFL Chronicle and Forspoken explored twists on tactical combat and action RPGs respectively, but I know for a fact Forspoken did not do well at all. That game, I personally enjoyed it, but I know that I'm like literally like I might be the only person that liked that game. While none of these games reach Final Fantasy level of success, that could change if Square Enix really does want to focus more on games outside of its biggest franchises. If the publisher really intends on diversifying the games it's offering, the easiest solution seems to be give more resources to developers already working on its most original titles so they can make the best versions of them. As much as lackluster sales for FF7 Rebirth might sting, getting a wide variety of games from Square Enix can only be a good thing for the players. Games like Final Fantasy 16, or if there's a Final Fantasy 17 that's going to be a giant project and have this insane budget, I don't think it's required. I really think they could take a step back and not dump all this money into the graphics of the game or into whatever. If they just focus on combat and story, I don't think it really matters how the game looks. I think it'll still sell fine. As long as the combat is fun and the story is interesting and it keeps you wanting more. Those kinds of things, that's what matters to me. That's what I think makes a game good. Combat, story, whatever. I'm not personally a big fan of those big games like Spider-Man. Don't really care for it. God of War, don't really care for it. Like, the games can be fun without all that giant budget. But let me know what you think down below. Would you rather have these giant big budget games like God of War, like Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth in future titles from Square Enix, or would you rather keep games like Octopath Traveler or DFL Chronicles, stuff like that, like the much lower scale games? Which ones would you rather have? Personally, I'm an Octopath Traveler style side. Give me the 2D, give me the over the top, just whatever, something basic, you know. But I saw this article on how Square Enix was struggling with apparently sales of Rebirth, and I kind of wanted to talk about it and give my input on why it's not holding up to Remake's sales, because obviously the pandemic and everybody's back at work and not sitting at home playing the game. So that's obviously going to hurt sales a little bit here and there, and that's something that I don't think they really take into account. But for more Final Fantasy VII Rebirth updates and content in general, be sure to like and subscribe. I try to post videos 3 times a day, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, on FF7 Rebirth or Final Fantasy 14, or really anything Square Enix that I see that pops up. So if you are into Square Enix games, welcome to the channel. Click up here for more Final Fantasy 7 content, and I'll see you guys next video. Peace.